You know that sensation of effervescence you get on your tongue when you drink something fizzy? It's not actually caused by the bubbles. CO2, when it's pressurized, it dissolves into liquid. It creates something known as carbonic acid. It's actually the acid that creates the zing in your mouth. So what does carbonation have to do with realism in video games? A few months ago I fell victim, as I'm sure many of you did, to the tidal wave of GTA 6 trailer breakdowns. Each video promised to show anywhere between 10 to 100 hidden details that we missed. Now, personally, I would describe myself as more apathetic than I would enthusiastic towards the game itself, but I'll admit to being mildly swept up in all the excitement. I ended up watching a couple of these aforementioned videos just to satisfy my curiosity. It turns out that the detectives of the internet zoomed in and indiscriminately picked apart each and every pixel, combing through every microsecond as if they were searching for the meaning of life. But yeah, it turned out to be just good old-fashioned obsession with an upcoming video game. These bottles in particular garnered a fair bit of spotlight. The mere concept of condensation, reflection and of course carbonation on an item so trivial blew the collective minds of the hardcore GTA fanbase. I'm not going to tell them to calm down, touch grass or anything like that because, frankly, this level of detail is insane. Rockstar are intent on wowing their audience with the most infinitesimal details, and minus the really obnoxious fans, it's genuinely quite nice to see a huge part of the gaming community celebrate something together. Especially when all too often the gaming discourse seems to be teething with hostility and hatred because of a controversial release or a politically divisive statement. Anyway, I digress. Let's get back to these bottles. The funny thing is, while the fascination stems from these bottles, it's not really about the bottles at all. It's about what they represent. The bubbles rising, the way that light bends around the glass, the way that the liquid inside seems to be simulating accurate physics. They are all impressive details, but they only really matter in context with the wider world. What they allude to is this idea of Rockstar chasing this ultimate realism. Just like Red Dead Redemption 2 before it, the ambition seems to be building immersion through the smallest, most granular details. If the items on a shelf follow the same laws of physics and chemistry as they do in real life, what does that mean for the rest of Vice City? Because let's face it, that's what's being sold here. Not just a world we can piss about in, but a version of reality so immersive that we forget our own exists. What I don't need to tell you is that the adherence to realism in video games is entirely selective. For instance, the fizz of a drink might be a damn near perfect reflection of what we'd expect to see in our day-to-day lives. But seeing a car flip 6 times, land with the structural integrity of a rubber duck, and for the driver to emerge completely unscathed, tends to bridge the gap between what is reasonably true to life and what isn't. Now, my expectation is for the vehicles to have similar properties to that of GTA 5, maybe even GTA 4 if we're lucky, but you get my point. Rockstar's attempt at ultimate realism isn't really practical, at least not 100% of the time. There's a dilemma that forms through using this part-time ultimate realism, and it's that it invites advanced levels of criticism. If you don't believe me, take this clip from YouTuber 2ClicksPhilip, an undeniably insightful creator who dissects aspects of the trailer, sharing an interesting perspective on the tech potentially used. He then adds the following line.
There appears to be bubbles rising from within, although you'll soon notice it's a rapidly repeating animation, which is a bit disappointing. Although Half-Life Alyx had a repeating animation as well.
A bit disappointing. Now, this definitely raises an issue that gamers sometimes have unrealistic expectations, but that's perhaps a conversation for another time. The thing is, he's not wrong. The animation does repeat. The point I want to make is that realism, no matter the game, will always reach a limit defined either by what the developers consider worthwhile including, or more crucially, by what they believe the players will find fun. We've discussed fun as a concept before. Conventionally, it's something that games will prioritize, but this has seemingly shifted over the last few years with the advent of immensely challenging games, even more so with the growing popularity of rage games. It strongly suggests that gamers will continue to engage with something in spite of the fact that they are being actively frustrated by it. So the idea that developers will sacrifice what is typically fun for what is realistic isn't beyond the realm of expectations. especially when so many gamers are crying out for realism and pushing against fantastical design. And of course, realism doesn't just manifest in the form of what visually aligns with our own reality. Character behaviours, for instance, are an enormous contribution towards the depiction of realism in our games. Our hero doesn't just shoot bad guys and find treasure, they fill out paperwork. They reminisce about their wedding day. They recycle. It can be argued that these scenarios are in fact very fun to the right player. I count myself among them. But I'd be lying if I said I went back to Uncharted 4 from time to time to watch Nathan Drake tickle his wife on the sofa. Love them or hate them, Naughty Dog are masters at constructing grounded atmospheres and weaving in expertly crafted emotional gut-punching scenes, further elevated by outstanding audio and visual design. And it's all under the guise of what they might call acute attention to realism. But it's then all counterbalanced by a laundry list of unrealistic exceptions. In order to replenish ammunition, Nathan Drake will need to find magazines from any other equivalent firearms. That makes total sense. If Ellie or Joel happen to be injured at any point, then they need to apply first aid. These aren't necessarily gaming tropes, they are adherences to realism. We can logically conclude, based on the fact that these games are set in our reality, that a weapon can be reloaded, that a wound should be treated. But then we must suspend our understanding of reality when Ellie can virtually undo a bullet hole in her sternum with alcohol and a bandage, and Drake can carry several magazines and God knows how many artifacts, presumably in his pockets. Now keep in mind that this isn't a criticism, we can all appreciate that this is a necessity. And the fungus infection and superhuman abilities are evidence enough that, despite each title's backdrop, Naughty Dog are only using our reality and its chemistry and physics as pure guidelines. What this really highlights is the conflict that pseudo-realism promotes. Everything feels entirely real, until suddenly it doesn't. Developers actually have my full sympathy when it comes to this issue. One can only imagine the arguments that passionate game developers can find themselves in when trying to agree on the core principles of how their world is governed. Because of course the constant tug of war that realism creates doesn't just start when the player loads in, it starts in the writing room. At some point, ideally in the earlier stages, a studio will have to sit down and agree on something called verisimilitude. This is the internal logic that defines what can and what cannot happen in their world. What level of catastrophe is a fireball directly hitting the player? Is gravity something that the player needs to be constantly wary of? What happens if I drive my vehicle directly into this fuel tanker? Now of course these games aren't quote unquote realistic, and the end result for each scenario, while fairly illogical in our own reality, they do somehow make total sense within the confines of each game. That's verisimilitude at work. Executing this perfectly is, I would imagine, fairly tricky. After all, developers will simply rely on the player's ability to suspend disbelief on a regular basis. A quick shot of some kind of healing solution will cure what ails you. Or perhaps a full night's sleep will mend the injury caused by a sword that was buried in your forehead just a few minutes ago. Both Ghost Recon Breakpoint and Kingdom Come Deliverance are, for all intents and purposes, poised as games that embrace realism. Granted though, they are positioned at vastly different locations on the spectrum. But what we can see in both games is evidence of developers applying their own discretion. There must have been a constant fight deciding how far each game can be pushed in pursuit of realism. And unsurprisingly, realism in the context of personal injury tends to be where developers take the most liberties. Fortunately, gamers will generally just accept that either an injection, a bandage, or a full night's sleep as a perfectly suitable process to overcoming even the most life-threatening injury. But then there's always the option to avoid the burden of how to illustrate injury and restoration almost entirely, with a different commitment to realism. I should clarify that maintaining a farm and transporting goods across Europe certainly has its dangers. But where most games are focused around the idea of extreme situations going extremely wrong, the simulation niche looks at very ordinary situations and them playing out exactly as intended. More often than not, they are just showcases of the industry, each game being a labour of love designed by hobbyists, so the adoration for the real-life counterpart is usually clear throughout the experiences. Even so, none of these games are realistic in a strict sense. At the risk of sounding like our friend 2Clicks Philip from earlier, the surface level realism of sim games is a bit disappointing. Don't get me wrong, I love driving around Europe building my trucking empire, but I want to dive in head first and truly live the life. The tedium of filling out paperwork, leaving the cabin to stretch my legs and grab a coffee, going through all the checks you can imagine at the Swiss border. But, equally, don't make me wait around for too long. Oh, and if I crash, I want to be able to skip the roadside assistance process. And, well, I want to be able to jump in and jump out of a job whenever I want. See what I mean? Realism is such a strange entity in games. We want so much, but not too much. We want plenty of freedom, but not too much freedom. I want unlimited lives, so if I screw up, which I inevitably will, I want to be able to try again. But I also want to be punished adequately enough to make sure that it doesn't feel unrealistic. It's funny, we chase realism like it's the thing that makes a game feel alive, like it's the definitive pathway to immersion. But of course it's never actual realism, only an illusion constructed with rules and exceptions to those rules that are just plausible enough to keep us believing. Which is why it's so interesting that these bottles, in all their perfectly rendered carbonated perfection, cause such a massive distraction. Just something worth thinking about.